So when you're taking notes out of a textbook, I think a common mistake is just to either write down everything that you see or maybe just write down the key concepts. And so doing those things, like trying to take notes in a way that's just very fast and superficial, will pretty much ensure that the notes don't actually mean that much to you. Instead, a better way to take notes out of a textbook or to like read a textbook is to start, make note of key vocabulary. So for instance, radical equations, extraneous solutions. Notice this is on page 52. I'm probably going to want to make sure I know what both of those things are. And then here it says radical equations are ones that have a radicand. And so I see this equation with a radical in it. That's pretty common sense. I don't even know if I really need to write that down. It's an equation with a radical. So then I look at key concepts here, and we have some steps to solving equations. Now, if I were you, I wouldn't write this down verbatim. I would actually try and paraphrase it. So for instance, when I read step 1, isolate the radical on one side of the equation if necessary. Maybe I would just say isolate the radical on one side. Or maybe instead of isolate, I would say get the radical by itself. Step 2, raise each side of the equation to the same power to eliminate the radical and obtain a linear, quadratic, or other polynomial. You know, when I first read that, I'm not necessarily sure what it means even, so I might not even want to write these steps down until after I look at an example. And then step 3 says solve the polynomial equation using techniques you learned in previous chapters. Notice, right now I haven't written anything down. I'm just getting a feel for what's going on here. Now when I look at the first example, example number 1, solving a radical equation, I'm going to see if they use the steps here. So step 1 was to isolate the radical, and it looks like this radical is already by itself on one side. So then the next step was raise each side of the equation to the same power. And if I look here, I see that they're cubing both sides. And that makes sense to me because I know a cube and a cube root cancel out. And then I see that they take 3 cubed and they get 27. And over here it cancels. And then let's see, they subtracted 7 from each side, divided both sides by 2, and they got 10. And then down here, they checked their answer by plugging it back into the original and seeing if it really worked out. Because this problem is fairly simple, it might not actually be one that I write down. Maybe I just read through it, make sure I understand what's going on, and then move on to the next problem. When I go on to example number 2, I see that they've got a story problem. I don't necessarily need to jump in and start copying the story problem down word for word. First, I should just read it and make sure that I understand it. So I would go through line by line. I would make sure I understood what the variables are. I would look at the solution, and it looks like, okay, they took the velocity, 54.5, and they plugged it in for like where y would go usually. And then it looks like, shoot, how did they get from here to here? Well, the nice thing about your textbook is they've got some directions over on the side. So they divided each side by 6.3. Why did they do that? Well, okay, that makes sense because this is 6.3 times the square root. And then it looks like they squared both sides to cancel the square root out. And then, let's see, they subtracted 1013 from both sides. That makes sense. Divided each side by -1. Okay, I see what they're doing here. Because this one makes sense too, like none of the steps were that hard, maybe I don't write it down. You keep reading through and trying to identify things that make sense and things that don't. And if something stands out to you as something that doesn't make sense, for instance, on example 3, we have a standardized test practice, so there's multiple choice here, and we're trying to identify the solutions. And when I look at the solution, 4x to the 2/3 equals 36, I see that they divided by 9, that's okay, or divided by 4, sorry. So 36 divided by 4 is 9. But I don't know exactly why they raised each side to the 3/2 power. So maybe this is the first example I write down in my notes. And then I would keep going. And anything in the notes that looked big and complicated and scary, if I didn't understand it, those are the examples I would write down. And when I'm writing down the example, I would write it down exactly like I see it. And when I get to a part that doesn't make sense, I would put a little question mark by it and maybe actually write a question in the margin of my notes so that I could remember to ask that question in class the next day. If you guys follow this note-taking technique where you only write down what you need to write down, only the things that are confusing, and you read through the problem before you try to write it down, I think you'll actually get more out of your note-taking than just copying everything you see or only writing down bold words or things in boxes. Thank you and happy note-taking.